Right then, I think we'll make a start. Good morning, everyone. Monday morning again. How quick was that weekend? Welcome to our Rendered Invisible Telling LGBTQ Stories from the UK's Built Heritage event. I'm Beverly Gormley and I'm the Programme Manager for the Heritage Trust Network. If you don't know us, we're the UK's umbrella organisation for not-for-profits who are rescuing and restoring historic buildings and places. Thanks to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Make Your Mark, we've got some fantastic speakers lined up for you this morning. We've got Norena Shopland, who's an author and historian who specialises in LGBTQ+ history, Chief Executive Officer of Heritage Lincolnshire, Greg Pickup, Alice Ullathorne, who's Nottingham City Council's Heritage Strategy Officer, PhD candidate Chris Reid from Northern Ireland, and Andrew White, who's the National Lottery Heritage Fund's Director of Wales. So I'm sure you'll agree, some fantastic speakers. After the first three speakers, there'll be a 5-minute comfort break, followed by a short video from Make Your Mark. Then we'll have our final two speakers, followed by a question and answer session. So feel free to ask any questions in the chat box, or if you'd rather stay anonymous, then please do send either me or my colleague Sarah Pearce a private chat message and we'll ask your questions for you at the end. The usual Zoom etiquette that we all know by now applies, and we'd really appreciate it if you could stay on mute until the Q&A session at the end at least. You might notice in the top left-hand corner of your screen, we're using a live speech-to-text transcript service called Otter AI. This is especially for people with hearing difficulties, and if you click on it, a separate screen should pop up with the transcript. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Norena. Welcome, Norena.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here. Can everyone see that?
We can.
Great, thank you very much. But the first thing to say about LGBT terminology is really there's two sets of terminology that you need to be aware of. One is modern terminology and historic terminology, because most of the words and phrases that you're familiar with and we use consistently today don't really date back to more than the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the time when the sexologists were examining what makes human sexuality. And it's worth bearing in mind that the word heterosexual wasn't coined until this time either. So, as I said, most of the terms that are used regularly today cannot be applied to history earlier than the late 19th century. And even the terms that came into use during this time have changed enormously. We've added a lot of words to the list and definitions have changed. The word homosexual has a different definition in the late 19th century than it did in the late 20th century. So you need to be aware that the terminology that you're currently using has changed a great deal over the last 100 years. And before, as I said, the late 19th century wasn't in use anyway. And in terms of current terminology, there's a lot of places you can find glossaries, word lists, all sorts of documents to help you understand this sometimes quite bewildering array of terms. And organisations quite often include glossaries. Stonewall do a list. And if you just Google LGBT terminology, LGBT plus glossaries, you'll find all sorts of lists. This is one of the most extensive ones that I've found. This is Homosaurus, and it's an international vocabulary, and the site's not very good. If you see at the top left side, you can see at the top you've got vocabulary and search, and you can either browse through the list and just look at different terms, and if you click on them you get this little sub menu. which tells you what the term is, it gives you a definition and it gives you a bit more information. Or you can search for a particular term. So if you use the search facility, you can look up any term that you're not sure about and it will give you a definition. It is very extensive. It still lacks on some of the historic terms, but on the whole, it's a very good list, particularly for modern terminology. Or there's this, and I quite like this. This is a book that's just come out this year. It's called The Queen's English, and it's written by Chloe Davis. And the reason I like it is because it's very informal, it's a lot of fun, it's very colourful, and it puts a lot of things in context. It tries and uses the words and phrases within a context of a sentence. So that's quite fun. So if you want something on your bookshelves, that's quite good. You can get it from any major book supplier. One of the difficulties, as I said, when we're looking at LGBT history and talking about individuals from the past is what terminology do we use? As I said, most of the terminology that we're currently using doesn't date back to earlier than the late 19th century. So when you're talking about somebody like King Edward II from the 14th century, what terminology do we use? If you have a look at a lot of LGBT plus timelines, and there's a lot of them, Wikipedia do several of them, you quite often see Edward II described as a gay king. And this is because predominantly he had two significant relationships in his life, one with Piers Gaveston and later with Hugh Despenser. And so it's those two relationships which dominate his life. However, he was married. Most people had to get married in the past, and we need to keep this in mind, that when we talk about historic people, quite often they were married. And of course, royalty had to get married, they had to have kids. And Edward got on quite well with Isabella. They had a reasonable relationship until Hugh Despenser ruined everything. And they have 5 children. So the question is, if we refer to Edward as gay, are we airbrushing Isabella out of his life, out of his sexuality? And so we avoid using words like gay. And a better way of describing him is sexually fluid. And we tend to prefer those kind of terminology, or use phrases such as, these are individuals whom today we would recognize as gay, or today we would recognize as lesbian. Because, of course, people have been gay or homosexual and lesbian throughout history. It's the terminology that's changed, and also the understanding for the majority of history. Homosexuality was seen as a physical act. It was something that you did. It wasn't something you were. And so you were believed to engage in a specific act, and you could become addicted to that act, which is why you then later see that the idea of this cure, if you're addicted to it, you can be cured of it. And it's not until the late 19th century, where the work of the sexologist comes in, where there's a realization that people are born, as we would refer today, gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans. So we can't inflict terminology on people who they would not have used that as self-identification, and they wouldn't have understood the concept. And I've been doing a lot of looking at how do you find LGBT plus people from the past if you can't use modern terminology. And I had a look at this in this publication called Queering Glamorgan, and I'll put all the links in later, so don't worry about the links. It's a research guide. Don't let the title put you off. That was the funding criteria. It was funded by the Welsh Government and published by Glamorgan Archives. And in the second half of the publication, I look at how we find people, and we have to stop looking at what people are, how we think of people as gay or lesbian or trans, and what people were doing. And the most common thing that people were doing was cross-dressing, cross-working, and cross-living. And a lot of people were doing this, not just people that we would identify today as lesbian or trans or gay, but we can find these people in searching for these terms. That led to this book, A Practical Guide to Searching LGBTQIA Historical Records. There's 4 chapters on terminology and looking in depth at heritage organisations like libraries, archives and museums, and what we can do to showcase LGBT history once we found it. And although it takes LGBT plus as its subject, it is a toolkit for almost researching any diversity or other subjects. And when I started looking at what people were doing rather than what they were, the floodgates basically opened, and I was able to recover something in the region of 4,000 articles just on women's history. I wanted to concentrate specifically on women's history and trans history, because as we know, most of history is dominated by men's history. So I wanted to do a lot more on women's history. And as I said, once I started looking at cross-dressing, cross-working, cross-living, I found when I got to 4,000 articles, I just stopped because I couldn't spend my whole life researching one subject. And what happened was there were so many articles that a lot of it, of the 4,000 articles, this book only took up about 10% of those articles. And so there's still an enormous amount that hasn't been written about. And most of these articles are unpublished outside their original source. And this is the sort of thing that I was recovering. And most of LGBT history is predominantly comes from the latter part of the 20th century. Prior to that, again, it's not really looked at until the late 19th century. But people started to really begin to write and research this history in the second half of the 20th century. But it was predominantly about individuals trying to identify people from the past and examining their lives. And it's only in the last couple of decades that there's been a lot more research and attention paid to places, to landscapes and buildings, historic buildings. And so what became clear through all this research is there's an enormous amount of locations that can be used to share these kind of stories. And you see there's just a couple here from the 19th century. And quite often when people were cross-dressing, they would be arrested because they were seen as nefarious. They were seen as being in disguise. And the law came about through the Deuteronomy 22:5 from the Bible, which says a man must not wear the clothes of a woman, nor must a woman wear the clothes of a man, because those who do are an abomination unto the Lord. And so you see this in many European countries. It was against the law for people to cross-dress. In Britain, it never was, but people could be arrested. And you often find you can trace these people through a variety of buildings where they're arrested, where they're taken. And sometimes you can find quite extensive stories. This is an individual called Eliza Edwards, somebody who was, it's very well known in trans history today. She was ascribed male at birth, self-identified as a woman, presented as a woman, and became an actress. And she wasn't a particularly well-known actress. But it's her death that caused all the publicity. She dies in 1833, and there's an enormous amount of publicity surrounding her death, because in the words of the newspapers at the time, she was found to be biologically male. And so, as I said, there was a great deal of publicity about her. She had died at St Margaret's Workhouse in Westminster. The inquest was carried out at the Coach and Horses in London, and the post-mortem was done in St Guy's Hospital. So once you find these people, because they create such enormous interest in the media, you can often trace them through various buildings, and so we can build up their life in that way. There is an enormous caveat about terminology in terms of historical people, and nothing about us without us should really become your catchphrase. If you're going to do anything either modern or historic about LGBT+, then you really must talk to local groups, to people who have knowledge of terminology, because it can really work out quite badly if you get it wrong. This is a portrait of the Xvaledent. This is a French individual who's very famous in trans history. There's an enormous amount that has been written about this individual. Despite that, when the National Portrait Gallery bought this portrait in 2012, they put it up, they constructed the label, they wrote down their website and described this individual as he. And as you can imagine, there was an outcry and people pointed out that this was a trans individual and therefore the pronoun was being used incorrectly. And if they're going to use any pronouns, then they should use they. And so they duly corrected all the stuff. And if you look at the description on the National Portrait Gallery site now, either it moves away from using any pronouns, they talk about the Chevalier or Dion or this individual, and where they do use the pronoun they. So it's slightly embarrassing for them. So this is an example of how things can go badly wrong if you don't consult. And the same thing happened with this. This is a plaque that was put up to Anne Lister, who of course became very popular. There was a TV program about her, and the Holy Trinity Church in York decided that they would like to put up this plaque to commemorate the commitment that Anne Lister made to Anne Walker. And the plaque on the left is the original plaque, and they described her as gender non-conforming. She was gender non-conforming in that she did wear very masculine clothes. She didn't wear men's clothes. She presented as female, she identified as female, and but she did wear quite masculine clothes. And so they decided to refer to her as gender non-conforming. All hell broke loose because she is predominantly known for her same-sex attraction and her relationships with women. And so therefore they had to pay for a new plaque to be made. This time they used the word lesbian. Again, there was arguments about use of the word lesbian because this is a term that did not exist at the time. If anything, she would have been called a Sapphist, but Sapphist is not a term that modern audiences are particularly familiar with. So you're in this strange dichotomy in that you can't use modern terminology to describe people from the past, but you have to use modern terminology in order to engage a modern audience. So, so sometimes you can fall into trouble with this. The other criticism of this plaque was that they reversed the rainbow. If you look at the left-hand plaque, it's got pink on the outside going into red. Well, of course, the rainbow doesn't work that way. It starts red and goes into pink, which they had to then correct on the right-hand plaque. And one of the other difficulties that we have is people policing our history. I was really the first person to look at Welsh LGBT history, a project called Welsh Pride, which was funded by the then Heritage Lottery Fund, which is now NHLF. And at the time, I tried to engage the people at Plasnewydd on Anglesey about this individual, Henry Paget. And I was told that it was all rumours and innuendos and they weren't going to engage. And despite several attempts over the years to engage them, basically they decided to shut the doors on us, on our history, and they would tell us what we could and couldn't do in relation to this building. And so it came as some surprise a few years later when the National Trust published this booklet, Prejudice and Pride, about their properties which were linked to LGBT history, and there on the front cover is Henry Paget. And what had happened was basically there was a new management, and the new management was a lot more open to inclusivity.
Sure 5 minutes left, Norena.
Thank you. I'm sure people have seen this. This is Pride of Place, England LGBTQ heritage, and they've got a lot of very useful articles on the left hand. There's just some of them on the left hand side, and what they're doing is doing a map of properties that have any kind of LGBTQ heritage. One of the issues I have with it includes places in Wales and also the Isle of Man, which of course are not in England. So finally, just to end, one of the difficulties of doing LGBT history, talking about LGBT, is that we tend to do it in specific periods, like February is History Month, June is Pride Month, August is Welsh Pride Month. And so we tend to do a lot of the work in these periods, and they become sort of like other, standalone. These are things that we do this particular month. And it's true of a lot of diversities. People do Black History in October for History Month. But the difficulty is that all these diversities are being singled out. And you have 10% of this diversity and 20% of that diversity. But when you add everything together, because everybody in their life has diversity, whether it's race, religion, disability, any kind of diversity, when you put all of them together, you get 100% of the population. And therefore you should be aiming for full inclusivity, not standalone diversity just in history months. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Norena. That was absolutely fascinating. As I said to you when we caught up on Friday, you have so many accolades that it was hard to bring them all in
I could go on for another 2 days.
But please do put any links in the chat box and to your books as well. That would be fantastic. Thank you for that. Right. So we'll move over from Wales. We'll move to, I don't know whether Greg's in Derbyshire or Lincolnshire at the moment.
I'm actually in Nottinghamshire, so between the two.
I was close. Welcome, Greg. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me try and share my screen to begin with. I have to admit, I'm slightly regretting being in the running order, having to follow Norena this morning, but that's definitely set the bar. Okay. I'm hoping that you can all see my first slide there. Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name's Greg, Chief Executive of Heritage Lincolnshire, Heritage Trust Network member, but I'm here this morning to talk to you all for a few minutes about a project I ran previously for the charity Derbyshire LGBT+, and that was the Other Stories History Project. That was, as with Norena's project, very generously funded by the, at the time, Heritage Lottery Fund, with a grant of £86,000. And this was a project that ran from 2017 to 2019. And as I mentioned, was run by the charity Derbyshire LGBT+, which was a charity that was formed in 1983 as Derby Friend, one of a network of organisations that were set up to offer befriending to initially gay men, lesbian women predominantly, but whose reach expanded over the course of 35 years to encompass what that charity now refer to as LGBT+. Before I talk to you about the project, I just wanted to touch on the terminology that we used for this project and that the charity Derbyshire LGBT+ use. I know many of you will have seen LGBTQ in particular used, and I think that is probably now the more commonly used for lots of work in heritage in particular. But the reason that we used LGBT and LGBT+ for this particular project in Derbyshire was a reflection on the fact that it came from this community group, and that's how they chose to define their audience, their work, their community. And in particular, the discussion about Q is an interesting one in that I think it is, to my mind, quite useful when you're talking about heritage, in that I think the word queer allows you to talk in a way that other parts of the language don't, in a more broad term about a community and a sensibility without being too prescriptive. The reason that we didn't use it for this project, and the reason that the charity didn't use it, is that particularly for some of the older service users of the social support groups and counselling and the rest of it for this charity, the word queer still carried overtones of the pejorative use from the earlier 20th century, and for them was still evoking a kind of traumatic past and one that they weren't keen to be reminded of. So that's the reason that in this instance we were using LGBT, but as I say, more and more commonly you see LGBTQ used, particularly in heritage circles. So I'll start by touching on the aims of our project. The aim came about after quite a few years of discussions about anniversaries of the charity's own founding in 1983, and the fact that many of the original founding members were becoming older, their memories were fading, and we were keen as an organisation to make sure that those were recorded for posterity. And I think many similar projects have been done from a similar basis, taking as a starting point the desire to record as oral histories the memories of those who went before and make sure that those are kept as a record. We were also beginning the project at a time of huge national, unprecedented, I think, coverage of 50 years since 1967, which was heralded as a kind of watershed in the LGBT plus kind of rights movements, albeit that actually 1967 refers to a very law change that only affected homosexual men and was actually quite limited in its scope. But nonetheless, the 50-year anniversary was one that saw many documentaries, TV programmes and the like. Within Derbyshire, we were keen to tell a local story about what life was like in our community, in the towns and villages and the city of Derby throughout this time, given that many of the stories that were being told were kind of focused on the metropolises. There was lots about, understandably, Manchester, London, Brighton, and we were keen to look at more rural areas and at what locally life was like during this time. We also wanted to tell the story of our own charity, as I mentioned, touching on Norena's point at the archives and see how far back in history we could go and how far back we could find records of people with other sexualities and gender identities in the records locally in Derbyshire. We were keen to work with new partners. We knew about the LGBT community locally, but that there were museums, libraries and archives who probably had materials about us or people like us, but didn't know what to do with them, didn't know how to talk about them. And we were keen to join the dots in the same way that Norena mentioned. I think, to my mind, the best way to do this work is to join forces, to take local organisations who are representing the community, who know about the terminology, who know about themselves and people like them, and join them up with people who are experts in heritage, whether that be built, archival, etc. A key part of the project for us was involving people actively in reclaiming their own histories and telling their story. And I think this would become possibly the most important part of our project. As a charity whose mission is to support, to empower LGBT people, there's power in story, there's power in narrative, and there's power in recognising the value of our own stories. And particularly, I think that's the case when these are oftentimes stories that have been obscured, suppressed, censored, hidden. There's power in bringing those to life, but there's also some care that needs to be taken in doing so, because often our service users at the charity had their own histories that might have been traumatic in some senses. And one of the things that we wanted to be very, very careful about was not re-traumatizing the already traumatized by digging up difficult histories, sharing them, confronting people with these pasts, with these sometimes troubling narratives, and then leaving them after we'd done that in a place where they weren't supported, and it brought out all kinds of things. So we were very careful in how we handled that. And finally, we wanted to share the history and the stories that we found with as many people as possible. And touching on the name of the project, it kind of goes back to Norena's earlier point. We recognised very early on that looking in the archives in particular, and the further back you go, the less useful it can be to use modern terminology. So the starting point for us was a really broad and, I think, generous view of history. We were interested in what other stories of gender identity and of sexuality were out there that hadn't been told or brought to light or brought to prominence in the past, and interested in shedding a light on those and saying, not let's decide whether we can call this person a lesbian, for example, as Norena was touching on earlier, but more saying, isn't this a really interesting story? Doesn't it tell us something really interesting about gender identity and sexuality? And let's have a discussion about where we go with that. That was the starting point. And as Norena mentioned, language is really, really important. One of the things we also recognised is that the history of the LGBT plus community is often not recognisably, initially at least, in buildings. It can be quite difficult to uncover and bring to light and get agreement to bring to light stories that relate to particular buildings. And when you talk about the history of a community, Derbyshire, for example, over a 30, 50-year period, there are many, many buildings that are associated with the community. and many of them have vanished or come and gone, or for a time been associated with the community, but then passed into different use, different ownership. And the image to the left is really indicative of that. So that's an image from October 1983 of the Pavilion Club, which was a members club in the middle of Leicestershire, Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire. Allegedly predates Nightingales as the earliest members kind of owned lesbian and gay, predominantly at the time, venue as it was badged. That was in a cricket pavilion in Shardlow in Derbyshire, and came to its end in 1983 with a fire, the causes of which are still contested. But it was a really important early social built heritage space that no longer exists. And though that no longer exists, there are traces of that story that are still there. So the insurance payout from the pavilion paid for the founding of Derby Friend in 1984, an office for the group in Derby, and also put funds towards similar organisations in Nottingham and Leicester, both of which currently survive as a result of this initial investment. And the name of the Derby LGBT Centre, the Pavilion Centre, for 35 years has carried on that legacy. So there are traces of that history that persist, and that we wanted to also make sure were recorded and highlighted so that they could continue and weren't also lost. I mentioned before about the 1967 anniversary. We were keen to have a look at how that was reflected locally. What did that mean for local people? What was happening in the press at the time? What were people's memories of this what was billed as a kind of really significant monumental change in the local areas? So we went to newspaper archives. We worked with the local studies library, also the Lesbian and Gay News Media Archive at Bishopsgate, which is an absolute treasure trove of information. They have been for many, many years painstakingly cataloguing national and local news coverage and tagging meticulously areas and terminology, so that when we arrived at Bishopsgate and said, do you have anything on Derbyshire, they brought out their Derbyshire files, which are just an absolute marvel. They do some fantastic work, and I think anyone who's interested in this history, I would encourage them to visit and have a look online at their websites. We recorded oral histories, which I mentioned were fortunate to have living locally. For example, in the Peak District, Matthew Paris, who had a front row seat to history through the Thatcher government, and record his personal, sometimes quite difficult emotional recollections of being inside the government at the time of the Section 28 legislation, for example, and to get some voices of local politicians and other influential people about their roles in trying to influence, albeit sometimes unsuccessfully, national change, and complement that with local stories of people who had been buffeted by that change, who had seen changes come about due to various pieces of legislation and changes in social attitudes. So what we ended up with was a collection of oral histories of a range of people from across the county that we could add to the record. We also looked at the local history of activism, organising, socialising. So you can see in this image, which is from the London Women's March in the 1970s, I forget quite what year, which is the Campaign for Homosexual Equality. There were local branches of this organisation that campaigned nationally for law reform for many years. And what we found looking at the records of the Campaign for Homosexual Equality, most of which are in LSE's Hall Carpenter archive, which is another brilliant archive that is worth a visit for anyone interested in this area of history. One thing we found, that there was a relatively short-lived Chesterfield group in the north of our county of Derbyshire, and looking through the minutes of their discussions, we could see that actually they were, even in the 1970s, talking about involving trans people in a way that took many other organisations many more years to do so. So there's complexity and there's nuance in these stories that we're able to uncover and bring to light through doing this research with our volunteers. A few things that we had to consider that are hopefully useful to touch on for anyone else considering engaging with this history. Language and labelling, I will leave to Norena, because I think she's covered far more eloquently than I could. Barriers from the past remain, in much the same way that Norena mentioned the National Trust. We found a similar thing. At the start of the project, we approached a number of partners, and we were delighted that some of them immediately were keen and said, we would love to work with you. The County Records Office were one such organisation who were absolutely brilliant and a partner of ours throughout. There were others who were more cautious, who were reluctant to engage because they were uneasy about labelling particularly prominent figures from stately homes and the like, and what might come out of that. So some of them didn't engage, some of them it took a while to engage, but the importance of having those in the heritage sector who were really keen to engage made our project. And it wasn't the case that they came to us and worked with us because they were confident. They came to us because they were open-minded and said, we want to learn more, we appreciate that, we need to work with you guys to do more of this work. And the Record Office, as I say, was censorship, past and continuing, I wanted to touch on, in that, as I mentioned, LGBT history is a history that at times has been censored, and there are also those within the community who may be happy to tell their stories, but may not want to do so in a way that makes their records public. So one thing that we did with our oral history recordings was to give people the option to kind of embargo their recordings. So we had one or two individuals who said, I'm happy to tell you my story, but I'd rather this not be made public, or at least not yet, or under certain conditions, or perhaps not using their name. So I think it's important to recognise that this is not ancient history we're talking about, that this is a live issue for many people. And coming on to the next point about diversity within LGBT+, it was interesting for us taking volunteers out to the local records office, the local libraries, and looking through historic headlines and the sort of headlines that were generated in the past. Derby Trader image here from 1987 about one of the very first grants of £1,400 awarded to a local homosexual group and the local outcry that resulted. It was important for us to recognise that we're not here smugly sitting in the 21st century thinking, oh, those were the bad old days, they're no longer with us, that this is still the way that parts of our community are represented today, and that this is not just our past, but also our present. And I'm particularly thinking here about the trans community and the coverage that we still see in the national media. And I think that creates a barrier in terms of engagement, in that we have people within our community who are still fighting for their rights in a much more fundamental way than the likes of me personally, frankly, and that whilst they're engaging in their own personal struggles, that actually engaging with them in a history project is not going to be an easy thing or necessarily top of many people's priority list. And it's important to recognise what people are dealing with today as well as what we dealt with in the past. Diversity generally, again, Norena has touched on. We were very aware that as a charity, we cover a large rural county, but also particularly in places like Derby, we're in a multicultural community made up of people from many different places. I was fortunate that with the Derbyshire LGBT+ charity, we have a social group of people from all kinds of backgrounds, made up predominantly of migrants, with whom we're able to do some work about personal histories and stories. But that isn't always easy, it can be quite time consuming. There are barriers of culture and language and shame and oppression that continue. And that meant that work that we did, which was some of the most valuable work, was also some of the most time consuming and some of the most kind of sensitive, painstaking work, but very much worth doing. So to echo Norena's point from earlier, I think it's important to be thoughtful about just going and talking to people about their history. There's a lot of nuance and care that's needed, and that's why you need LGBT+ partners and organisations who understand those communities to help you with that. I mentioned the benefits of LGBT and heritage partnership working, which I think are self-evident. The importance of leads was one that I don't think we appreciated at the start of our project, in that when we began, we knew we had certain sources we could go to start uncovering stories, but some of the most interesting stories that we found were by word of mouth and by encouraging people to just go away and think about things. So we knew we had some of the founders of our charity who we wanted to talk to and record their history as part of the charity's record of its own past. But in the course of the people, we were always keen to ask them who else we should be talking to, who has a really interesting story, who we might want to record. Similarly, our starting point for the conversation with the record office was that they said to us, can we have a look at what records you have, what stories you have, and add them to our collection? And we did that, but we also countered it with, there must be things in your own collection that are of relevance to our community that perhaps haven't been examined in this light. What can you come and show us? And off the back of that, we had some amazing finds that we then brought to light in conjunction with the Derbyshire Record Office when we put an exhibition on in Chesterfield Museum partway through the project to showcase the history of that local community. Finally, I mentioned earlier, but it is really important to mention trauma and well-being. This is a project that was run by a charity whose mission is all about LGBT well-being, and we had to be very careful in digging up lots of things from the past that can be uncomfortable. The terminology, the stories, the histories can be triggering, can be traumatic, and whilst they're valuable and there's value in bringing them to light, it's important not to underestimate what that can do to people and how we can balance that. So a few stories from the archives, and again, Norena touched on this, dozens and in fact hundreds and hundreds of records in the newspaper archive that relate to gender identity and sexuality. And some of them are absolutely fascinating. But to echo Norena's point, the important thing to us was to not jump to conclusions, to not say, oh, we found a trans person from the 19th century, because what does that even mean? But instead to say, actually, we've got some really interesting stories here that tell us something about the history of gender identity and about sexuality. The case on the left is a particularly interesting one. This is a local newspaper article from 1925 about a man called Arthur, whose story was published in local newspapers in 1925. It was also the front page of the News of the World, with a salacious headline in the 1920s also. And this individual came to light because their niece was researching their family history at Derbyshire Records Office and couldn't find the birth certificate of their uncle Arthur. And it was only when they delved more into realised that was because Arthur had been assigned female at birth and had a female name on the birth certificate, off the back of which all of this came to life. So in addition to the newspaper record, we were able to capture some of the story of Arthur's long since past, of Arthur's living relatives, about his life and times. Which hopefully adds to the record and gives us a counterweight to the narrative, because we wanted to challenge the official narrative, which tells our history in one way, and add to that stories about our own lives, ideally told in our own voices. The images on the right at the top are of Lady Margaret Lucas Cavendish of Bolsover Hall in the north of Derbyshire, known colloquially as Mad Madge Cavendish, who was an educated and fearsome woman of the 17th century, who was involved in natural science and wrote plays and was a pretty formidable woman. She wrote a play in the 1660s called The Convent of Pleasure, about women living with women in all-female relationships and what a utopia that would be. And we were able to bring stories like that to light. Again, not to say that Mad Madge was necessarily lesbian or that this was a lesbian play, but to say actually the history of how people have talked about gender and sexuality is really interesting. And isn't it interesting that this play was probably performed in the gardens of Bolsover Castle, and that these conversations are being had centuries ago in some form or another. Bottom right is one of our LGBT plus community heroes in Derbyshire, Edward Carpenter on the right, after whom the whole Carpenter archive in LSE is named, who was, as Norena said, a kind of an author, human rights activist, in discussion with lots of early sexologists. His book, The Intermediate Sex, in 1908 was incredibly influential, and he lived relatively openly with his George Merrill in a Peak District village in Derbyshire. Relatively undisturbed, happy existence, other than one or two instances. And it was useful for us to have characters like Edward Carpenter as a counterweight to some of the more bleaker stories of criminalisation and persecution that we found as we were going through our project. Sharing our history, I touched on earlier, key aim of our project. One thing that we did, talking about trauma and headlines and labelling and stereotypes, the top right image there shows some of our stickers that we later made into badges. In order to reclaim our history, one of the conscious things we did was to try and reclaim some of the terminology, some of the vocabulary that had been used as pejoratives and against us in the past, and reclaim those. So we took headlines from newspaper articles in the past and put them on stickers and badges and invited people to reclaim them and wear them. And these were mostly at Pride festivals that we attended over the course of 3 years. And they went down an absolute storm, particularly amongst younger people. And we saw a huge appetite for LGBT history amongst many of those younger people. The notorious lesbian sticker in particular, which comes from a 1950s Derbyshire newspaper article, was one that we kept running out of, that went down a storm. And it was through acts like that that we felt we were able to kind of take back some of that historic narrative. A few useful links and sources. The source guide that I went to initially, which I think might predate Norena's own, which I'm sure is far more up to date and comprehensive, was one from Manchester Libraries, which I'm happy to share the link to. But it's important to remember that it can feel like you're starting off by yourself when starting a project like this, but actually there are many, many other local projects who've done great stuff and national projects. The Oral History Society in particular has an LGBTQ special interest group, and amongst their members there's a huge amount of expertise and experience about carrying out this kind of work. So that's run through the Other Stories project in Derbyshire. I wanted to finish by talking about a few kind of takeaways for anyone considering engaging with this history. There are some obvious points. I know many of the attendees and those listening will be involved in built heritage, and I think there are some things that we can easily consider about things like bathrooms that, to my mind, don't need to be gendered. And I think there are some things that we can do within our built heritage projects to make sure that we are explicitly, overtly, and also kind of in other considerations, making sure that our spaces are safe and open and welcoming for LGBT people. I think that's a good starting point, but also working with local LGBT groups to look at whether there is a queer history associated with a building or a site or a person that can be brought to light, and how that can be done sensitively and in a considered way. The final thing I was going to finish with was to talk about younger people. As I mentioned, one of the things that I loved about this project was that when we would take some of this material to Pride festivals, when we'd engage with volunteers, the most enthusiastic response we got to this was from younger people. And I think if heritage projects want to engage with young people, there are youth groups up and down the country full of people who are enthusiastic, who are active, who are interested in the story of people like them from previous generations. And I think there's huge merit in making partnerships between younger people's groups and heritage organisations to bring some of that to light. So apologies, I've gone over slightly, but I will finish it there.
No apologies needed, Greg. That was fascinating. Thank you very much. So much food for thought. And I have to apologise that my laptop crashed during the first couple of minutes of your presentation. So I just wanted to ask if the oral histories that you talked about, are they available for the general public to listen to, or are they archived somewhere?
Both. So we have the recordings themselves, some of which are on video. We produced a series of exhibition boards for those, many of which are now on display in Derby LGBT centres, shiny new offices in the entrance hall. I went to the opening of the new centre last week, and those are all on display in the entrance hall. And they're also working on a follow-up project to allow those to be made available online and within the centre through things like listening posts, so that anyone who visits can get more information about the history of the community and the people behind the centre.
Fantastic, that's brilliant to know. Great stuff. Well, thank you, Greg. We're not going to fly very far around the country now, because I think Alice is in Nottinghamshire as well.
Hello, I'm not actually in Nottinghamshire, but I work in Nottingham for Nottingham City Council. I'm actually in Sheffield, and apologies for having to see two of me at once. That's obviously not very good. And apologies for not wearing my Nottingham City Council rainbow logo t-shirt, but it's far too cold today. I've got my Nana blanket, and I've also not got my notorious lesbian badge on that Greg gave me, because I've just moved out. I haven't got a clue where it might be. So to kick off, I wanted to talk about how we can actually start to think about recognising diverse heritage within the built environment, and how we can do that for LGBT plus history in the country. And part of that is we've learned about how to actually find stories about LGBT plus people within the country, but all of those stories all happen in a place and in a space, and heritage is kind of dead without stories anyway. But the counterpoint to that is actually it's kind of not about being rendered invisible, it's about being rendered visible. So it's about actually recognising the contribution that LGBT plus communities made to the life of our places within the country. So with no further ado, I will move on. So as Norena said, and it's a very hard act to follow, Norena and Greg, so do bear with me. So as Norena was saying, a lot of thought about LGBT plus heritage in the built environment started it's about 5 or 10 years ago now with Historic England's Pride of Place project. So the Pride of Place project was kind of a crowdsourcing project to recognise LGBT plus places within the country. And I mean, I find this map incredibly interesting, because there's London on 859, but then very close behind it on 246 is Nottingham. So there's an incredibly rich heritage of the LGBT plus community within Nottingham, which is a great thing for somebody like me as the heritage strategy officer. So moving from that idea of diverse heritage, as the heritage strategy officer, I've always wanted to make sure that diverse communities within the city are recognised, and there's a number of different ways that can be achieved. So for example, thinking about the different stories that come down to us, how we might actually recognise those stories within the built heritage, but also thinking about strategically when to do that, because that's a really, really important thing. And so my first kind of foray into this whole area was thinking about some of our historic buildings in the city and actually how they're represented on the National Heritage List for England, held by Historic England. So we have a Nottingham Heritage Action Zone in Nottingham, which is a Historic England programme, and part of that was to look at the National Heritage List for England in Nottingham. And what I was very keen to do is start to think about some of those diverse histories that we have in the city, and whether at the same time as that review of the list, whether we could actually think about presenting some of our more diverse stories within the list. So this building that you see in front of you is the headquarters of Raleigh. It was a building that we thought probably needed to be listed anyway, because it's by Howard, who's one of the most important architects within the city. But while looking into the building, I also found out from Nottingham Black Archives, from Panya Banyoko, who's one of the most important Black historians within Nottingham. She let me know about this civil rights struggle that happened around Raleigh, and the Raleigh building. I mean, originally Raleigh didn't let any Black workers work for them. So in a very diverse place like Nottingham, this is a really kind of retrograde step. And basically, local activists wrote to the president of Jamaica, who wrote back to Raleigh and said, "We're not buying any more of your bikes until you actually do something about this." They completely changed the policy, and basically they had one of the most diverse workforces while they were working in the city afterwards. And it was a great story for civil rights in the country. That is now within the listing description for the building, and all of those stories and those people are drawn out. So that is in a national list for historic buildings in the country. So that was a very important first step. Also, this was kind of one of the next things that we wanted to think about. So in terms of recognising heritage, there's different things that you can do. You can talk about the actual buildings themselves. To get something to become a listed building, there needs to be some sort of historical association with something. So for example, with Raleigh building, there was obviously the historic association of the civil rights movement, but sometimes there's no fabric that you can actually connect to that historical association, and in those cases you might think to have a plaque instead, marking where something happened, although there's no physical trace of it left today. So we very much thought when the son of Eric Irons came to us and said they would like, well, the sons of Eric Irons, the kids of Eric Irons came to us and said they would like some way of his contribution to the life of the city to be recognised. And so we kind of thought around, well, how can that actually be recognised? And we came to the conclusion that actually a really good way of doing that would be to have a kind of blue plaque on a building in the city where Eric Irons actually worked as a magistrate, and so we had this plaque unveiling in a couple of years ago in 2019. What we very much wanted to do is take advantage of timing, and I completely take Norena's points about fragmentation when you just think about history months and all of those sorts of things. The flip side of that is history months are a time where people are looking out for those really great stories about diversity and about it's going to definitely be in the news right from the start. And I think we always need to have our eyes open to opportunities in terms of actually making the news. So we had the plaque unveiling, and I mean, it was incredible the amount of buzz that came from that, which was absolutely brilliant, because we thought it was really important that Eric's story was acknowledged and represented and recognised, and people could see how important this guy was to the life of the city, and how nationally important it was that he was the first Black magistrate in the UK. And I mean, you know, we had, you know, national press. It was on the front page of the app for BBC. My most proud thing was that it was retweeted by Floella Benjamin and Lenny Henry, which I thought was absolutely amazing, that anything that I can have any role to do with gets retweeted by Floella Benjamin. That was the best one for me. So having that recognition is really important, because recognition is about seeing people and about seeing stories and about having that opportunity to actually recognise that actually kind of British history doesn't stop at you know, a point in time. It's something that's created and recreated all the time. It's something that's fluid and not necessarily something that doesn't relate to modern communities. So, okay, so the next thing I'm going to go on to is Nottingham's local list. So a local list is something where there's lots of things that are on the National Heritage List of England, and they meet a bar of national significance and national importance, and that becomes a listed building or a scheduled monument or a registered park and garden. There's also many things in many other places that are of less importance, but still help to tell the history of a place. So, for example, the building on the left hand side is the Palais de Danse in Nottingham, where, you know, generations of people went there and had their Saturday nights or what, and I'm sure it went well into Sunday mornings as well, as we're talking about Nottingham. So what we very much wanted to do was enable people within the city to be able to reflect their own heritage and their own personal heritage, and so we wanted to develop this local list which had criteria about, well, actually, how do we recognise different diverse histories and diverse heritage, and how can we actually recognise individual people's, you know, what they find really important about their heritage. So the local list is one way of doing that. So far, as you can see, we've got 82 assets on the list, and for me, the most important thing is that we've had 49 nominations from citizens in Nottingham. So I think that's absolutely brilliant. And some of the diversity of the heritage, as well as diversity of the stories, is reflected in this slide. So you have the Northern Bat, which was swinging bat in Basford in Nottingham, and Basford Library. You've also got a spigot mortar, which is just archaeology now, but it connects people from the city with international events. And then to the bottom left, and you know, this is a building that represents the LGBT community, as well as being a very good Victorian pub. This is the New Foresters, which has been an LGBT venue for a long time in the city. So this kind of lets you see, for a start, all of the different types of heritage, but also the kind of range of things that can be on a local list and not listed. None of these are listed buildings. All of these are on a local list. And in terms of the New Foresters now on our local list, and that's on our local list as an LGBT plus venue. So again, it's recognising, it's seeing the contribution the LGBT community has made to the city, which is a great thing. In other places, LGBT plus venues and buildings associated with LGBT plus history have been recognised on the National Heritage List for England. So, for example, the Vauxhall Tavern or Shibden Hall, their listing description of Shibden Hall was changed to reflect the history of Anne Lister, as Noreen talked about before. So that's the local list, and as I was saying, anybody is welcome to make a nomination to the local list, which is then considered against criteria that was created, and some of that criteria, it includes historical association, and that historic association with different diverse communities within the city, such as the LGBT plus community.
5 minutes, Alice.
Okay, brilliant, perfect. So in the last 5 minutes, I'll go on to Plaque. So I talked about Plaque before with the Eric Irons plaque. Some of my own kind of personal reasons for being, you know, really interested in LGBT plus history is because I'm chair of Nottingham City Council's LGBT employee network, and we held a competition for, well, where should the first blue plaque in the city recognising LGBT history should be within the city, and this was held during LGBT History Month in February, and this just shows you the diversity of the shortlist that we thought about, and the different types of buildings that can be associated with LGBT history. So again, the National Justice Museum, where there were trials for growth and decency, and other people from the LGBT community were tried about that place. Bottom left is Nottingham Women's Centre, which has been an advocate for the LGBT plus community in the city for a long time, and very early on represented trans women as women, which is one of the big debates at the moment, and it's great that there's this site. Flying Horse Inn was a gay bar from the 1960s, and then we come to the New Foresters that won, and the New Foresters won because it's been an LGBT plus venue recorded from 1938, and that makes it 30 years before the decriminalisation of homosexuality, and as Greg said before, it's decriminalisation rather than there wasn't ways to actually imprison people for being LGBT afterwards. But before that date, basically, if you went to that venue, you had to keep quiet about the fact that it was for the LGBT plus community, and you wouldn't. You would absolutely have to keep that secret. Nobody could know, or else it would be raided. And this was a safe space for the community, and it has been for 80 years. So I mean, it's an amazing venue. That plaque is actually going up on Friday, and we're going to have a big launch of it. And again, we're doing a press release. We're getting people to find out about this, and hopefully we'll get just as many press there as we did for Eric Irons, and I don't know who might retweet it this time, but I can only hope but it might be some icons from the LGBT plus community, and that's all the different ways that we've been recognising LGBT plus heritage, and some different things that you can think about to either celebrate your building or celebrate other buildings in your place. And that's about it, I think. I've probably talked enough.
Thank you, Alice. That was brilliant. Is there anywhere that people can see your local list?
Yes.
Or the map that you started off with?
Yeah, of course. I'll put the link in the chat. In terms of the two things that I was saying about Pride of Place, if you just Google Pride of Place Historic England, you will find that project. If you Google Nottingham local list, that will come up as well. But I'll put the two links in the chat so you can see.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to check those out later. So we're going to have a quick 5-minute break. So if we could come back at 11:16-ish, and then we'll hear from my colleague Sarah. So yeah, quick 5-minute comfort break for everyone, and we'll see you back here shortly. And we're back. I sometimes feel like we need a little bit of a countdown timer. Hope everybody's refreshed. Hope you're all enjoying it so far. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Sarah Pearce, who's coming to us from the north of Scotland, who's going to say a little bit about Make Your Mark.
Hi everyone. I'm learning so much this morning. I'm taking so many notes and so many inspiration for projects across the UK. It's getting these ideas and sharing it, which is so fantastic. So the Make Your Mark campaign in Scotland is essentially it's a collaborative project within a whole number of organisations from the heritage sector, and the whole goal is to increase the number and diversity of volunteers in Scotland heritage. So essentially we just want to make everyone feel welcome and really try and attract some new faces to heritage, and I'm sure a number of heritage organisations and community groups will recognise this challenge of getting in new volunteers. So I won't say much more because we've got a video that tells you all about it from our member of staff there, Erin. So I will pass over to that now. I'm not getting any sound on that. I don't know if anyone else is.
No.
Hi,
Oh, there we go.
Lauren Burke, and I am the communications officer for the Make Your Mark in Volunteering campaign, which is one of the co-hosts of today's event. And I'm going to give a brief introduction to the campaign. What is Make Your Mark? Make Your Mark is a campaign that aims to increase the number and diversity of heritage volunteers in Scotland. And the campaign is organised by a partnership of national stakeholders in Scotland's voluntary and heritage sectors, which you can see at the bottom of your screen here. I'll give a bit of context about how the campaign came to be. Make Your Mark emerged from the recognition of continued inequities in Scottish society at large, as well as in Scottish heritage more specifically. According to the 2018 Scottish Household Survey, those most likely to attend historical or archaeological sites are men, aged 35 to 44, with a degree or professional qualification, from higher socioeconomic and income groups, from less deprived areas, who are healthy and non-disabled. In other words, the heritage sector predominantly engages with those of privilege. Acknowledging that the heritage sector has more work to do in order to engage with more of Scotland's people, why did we choose to focus on inclusive volunteering as a key way to address this inequity? We did so because there is a positive feedback loop between inclusive volunteering and equitable community building. This means that inclusive heritage volunteering can deliver benefits to both Scottish heritage organisations as well as to Scotland's people. So how does this feedback loop work exactly? Research shows that engagement with the historic environment, such as through volunteering, increases empowerment and helps to build a greater sense of place. And these are two key factors in building stronger communities. In turn, stronger communities are more likely to feel a sense of belonging that engenders a willingness to volunteer. This benefits the heritage sector in two key ways. Firstly, more volunteers increases the human resource, tools, and assistance available to preserve, restore, and animate our heritage. And secondly, more diverse volunteers deepen the complexity of the stories and the histories that we can tell. Thus, ultimately, the Make Your Mark campaign's focus on inclusive volunteering will help to address inequity and at the same time safeguards and enhances the future of the heritage sector and our heritage. So who can join Make Your Mark? Any Scottish heritage organisation who works with volunteers or would like to begin working with volunteers can join Make Your Mark, including public, private, charitable, and other entities. We have a wide definition of heritage, and we welcome organizations that work with the natural and built environment, organizations that preserve and celebrate intangible heritage, volunteer-led organizations, civic trusts, local heritage and history groups, museums and galleries, historic houses and castles, libraries and archives, buildings and monuments, and also development trust associations. So why should your organization join Make Your Mark? Make Your Mark is free to join, and it also supports volunteer involving heritage organizations by connecting heritage volunteer coordinators nationwide to a peer-to-peer volunteer organizers network. This network was formerly known as the Heritage Volunteer Organisers Scotland, or HVOS, and they've teamed up with the Make Your Mark campaign. This group hosts knowledge share events every few months to focus on an aspect of inclusive volunteer management. In addition to the knowledge share events, which I've just talked about, the campaign also shares inclusive volunteering practice in a few other ways. Firstly, through the campaign's social media at Vol Organisers, and also through a regular e-newsletter that shares the latest in volunteer management and inclusive heritage practices. Make Your Mark also evidences volunteering impact to lobby for more funding and support for heritage volunteering programs, and also promotes volunteering opportunities to underrepresented audiences. The campaign is currently developing a volunteering portal so that organizations can advertise their volunteering opportunities with us, and also has connections with over 15 equality, diversity, and inclusion organizations. So if your organization is interested in joining Make Your Mark to access all of the resources and support that we have to offer, you can join us by filling out our expression of commitment to inclusive volunteering. This can be found on our website. It's a very short and easy to use online form. And this is found at makeyourmark.scot. Thank you all for your time today, and I hope to hear from you soon.
Okay, before we go onto YouTube and watch all the other videos available, so that's a brief summary of what's happening with Make Your Mark. If you're based in Scotland and you're interested in taking part in the campaign, tomorrow afternoon and Wednesday evening, we're running info sessions for any group who want to sign up and want to get some new volunteers on board. So I'll put the link to that in the chat. And anyone who's out with Scotland, there's lots of training and events that's going on through this campaign that would be beneficial to anybody. So I'll share the events page as well. But over to you now, Bev.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Erin, also who featured in the video. So now we're heading over to Northern Ireland and to Chris Reid. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Bev. I'll just share my screen. I have a propensity to ramble, so I do have notes. Give me one wee second.
Don't worry, I've got the timer.
Okay, yeah, you can shout at me if I bang on. Oh, hold on. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, I see nodding heads. Great. Well, look, thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this. I suppose I'll be focusing on one specific place today, which is Hillsborough Castle. And the LGBTQ+ tour we developed there. Before we start, and I think one of the really great things that's coming out of today is this conversation around language. So I just wanted to address the fact that we do use the word queer on the tour, and it's something that we articulate to visitors when they arrive. And I think what we have seen today and what you see in the literature on this subject is that there maybe isn't necessarily a concrete final right answer yet on how we should be using language, but certainly there are many, many, many amazing resources out there. I just bought Norena's book and it's brilliant. And I think as long as you're articulating to your visitors the choice you've made and you remain consistent with that, then I think, in my opinion, that's okay. So we have used the word queer, and we do acknowledge the difficulties that surround that word for some people as well. So I am a PhD researcher, and I was also an assistant interpretation officer at Historic Royal Palaces at the time that we were developing this tour. My PhD research has been very much focused on the heritage sector and its engagement with LGBTQ+ identity here in Northern Ireland. And I'm particularly interested in understanding the pathways and barriers to activism at our heritage sites. So understanding how we can engage with local and global issues and positively affect change in wider society. Because I really believe that heritage sites in particular can provide the perfect space for these contemporary issues to be explored. And more importantly, we can use our influence as trusted institutions to not only highlight injustice still prevalent in society today, but to challenge our visitors to really question their long-held beliefs and misperceptions. I also think it's important to take a look at your locale and the geography within which you're working. So I'm very Northern Ireland focused, and when I'm doing my research, it's important that I take that into consideration. So for example, in Northern Ireland, the decriminalisation of same-sex acts between men didn't take place here until 1982. Northern Ireland is a post-conflict region, and there are a lot of complexities that come with that, not least of all in terms of religion and identity, and attitudes to LGBTQ plus people can very much become embroiled in that as well. So all of that was kind of at the back of my mind when I was working with the team to develop the LGBTQ plus tour at Hillsborough Castle. And it became very important early on that we didn't just look at who was queer in the past, but we also explored the nuances around queer history and its relevancy to society today. So bringing back those contemporary injustices that people are still facing. Now, for anybody who isn't familiar with Hillsborough Castle, it is a mansion house in County Down, Northern Ireland. Hillsborough is the village that it's based in, and it was built by this man who was Will Hill, the first Marquess of Downshire. And he initially built it as a bishop's palace in the mid-18th century. He had great aspirations of making Hillsborough a cathedral town, but unfortunately it was never granted that status. So instead, the house became the family seat in Ireland, and it subsequently grew in size throughout the 19th century to become the building that you see today. Now, following the partition of Ireland in the 1920s, the house was purchased from the Downshires by the newly formed Northern Ireland government as a governor's residence. And that meant it became a de facto royal residence as well. And this remained the case until 1972, when direct rule from Westminster was introduced in Northern Ireland by the British government. And so the rule of governor was abolished, and it was replaced by the Secretary of State, whose official residence Hillsborough Castle remains today. And since then, it has been used as a space for significant diplomatic events and to promote diplomatic relations. So the Taoiseach Gareth Fitzgerald and the Prime Minister Margaret signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement in the drawing room in 1985. The Friday Agreement that brought relative peace to Northern Ireland was negotiated here. The then Prime Minister Tony Blair and the US President George W. Bush met to discuss the invasion of Iraq in the House. And the Queen met the then President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, in one of the rooms. And that was the first time the head of the British state had met with the head of the Irish state on the island of Ireland. So a really significant event in British and Irish relations. And it's still very much a functioning diplomatic and royal resident today. So you have Boris Johnson walking up that hill on the left with the Taoiseach Micheál Martin, and they met to discuss COVID-19 last year and also Brexit. And on the right, you have Prince Charles and Camilla at the official opening of Hillsborough in 2019. Now, back in 2014, Historic Royal Palaces, the charity which looks after the Tower of London, Kensington Palace, Hampton Court Palace, Banqueting House and Kew Palace, I always forget those, took on the management and care of Hillsborough Castle from the Northern Ireland government. And it was the first property, and is still the only property, that HRP looks after outside of London. And in 2019, after an extensive representation project, the house and estate was opened in its entirety to the public for the first time. And back in 2014, HRP as an organisation had recognised that the stories being told in their properties were coming from a very, very specific and narrow perspective. Often male, white, wealthy, non-disabled, cisgendered, heterosexual narratives. So ultimately those from the perspective, of those who held a position of power, and which you see a lot when you're researching history. It's those histories that were being most prominently recorded. And in order to change this, the curatorial teams in particular identified a number of themes that they wanted to research in more detail. And these included women's history, disability, colonialism, and LGBTQ+ history. And in 2017, a very significant year, as Greg mentioned, to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality in England and Wales, they introduced LGBTQ+ tours at the Tower of London and Hampton Court Palace, as well as commissioning a satirical drag performance entitled Long Live Queen James, which was performed at Banqueting House, and you can see a photograph of it there. And it looked at the rumours regarding James VI and I's sexuality and his close relationships with male courtiers. And that event was so successful that it has now toured throughout the UK, which is fantastic. So even before Hillsborough opened to the public, it was decided very early on that a regular LGBTQ+ tour would be part of the visitor offer. And it would run monthly alongside a number of other specialist tours. And that's something we really wanted to make sure happened from the get-go, that it wasn't something that we kind of wheeled out for LGBT History Month. It's something that was embedded in the visitor experience, and visitors could come back again and again and experience it throughout the year. And a collaboration between the public engagement and curatorial teams, as well as the involvement of staff, volunteers and local groups interested in LGBTQ+ history and those from the LGBTQ+ community, allowed this process to begin. And in 2019, August 2019, the tour was officially launched, and it ran on the last Saturday of every month up until March 2020, when COVID reared its ugly head. And unfortunately, guided tours of any nature haven't been possible inside the house since. But I have been told that very, very soon, we hopefully are going to be bringing those back, including the LGBTQ+ tour. And I have to say, when I first started researching this and working with the curatorial team, we did feel genuinely worried that we might just not find any queer stories at all, which I think is a very, very natural concern to have. But what I've found from researching these stories at a number of heritage sites now is that that fear is almost always unfounded, and you will more often than not be shocked by the amount of queer stories that you manage to uncover. So keeping all that in mind, I thought it would be quite useful to maybe take you through some of the stories that we have found at Hillsborough Castle, to give you some insight into how we have told them. So this is a photo of the state entrance hall at Hillsborough, and it's where visitors start their journey when they first come to the house. And when we were trying to identify LGBTQ+ stories, we looked first at Hillsborough's vast collection. And the first object we discuss on the tour is this painting in the state entrance hall of King William III. And here he is depicted as the young Prince William of Orange. Now, William is a very, very well-known figure in Northern Ireland. And he spent several nights at the 17th century home of the Hill family, which still stands in Hillsborough, and it's looked after by historic royal palaces as well. And throughout his reign, he was the subject of rumours regarding his relationships with two of his male favourites. And using this evidence, we posed the question to visitors as to whether same-sex attraction was being used as a way to undermine William. So were these just rumours that were being spread by his enemies because he was a new king? Or is it rooted in truth? Did he actually have these relationships with men? And either way, it's a reminder of the ways in which sexuality has historically been something to be hidden or ashamed of, but also its use as a weapon against people. And we try to remind visitors that for many people across the globe, this is still very much a real experience that they have today. And the intent behind this approach was really just to subvert the status quo. As I said, William is a very, very well-known figure in Northern Ireland. He's a very contentious figure in Northern Ireland. So for us to choose him had the potential to be a little bit controversial for us. But by using this image of him as a young boy, which is an image many people wouldn't have seen him presented as, it really challenges the sort of dominant, masculine, heroic image of him that people are used to seeing. And again, it's just about offering people new perspectives on stories that they've heard a million times over. And the next room we visit is the throne room. Probably one of the largest rooms in the house, and it's used for ceremonies and investitures today. And the object we focus on in this room is this tabard on the left. And this belonged to a man called Sir Arthur Vickers, who you can see in a photograph there wearing the tabard. So I'll tell you the story because it's a great story. So on the 6th of July 1907, a collection of regalia and insignia belonging to the Order of St. Patrick, also known as the Irish Crown Jewels, were discovered missing from a safe in Dublin Castle. And interestingly, the jewels were taken without any force from inside one of the most fortified structures in the centre of Dublin. And many theories have emerged over the past 100 years as to how this could have happened. And there's debate around who the true culprits were. But one of the most intriguing suggestions relates to, as it was described at the time, a homosexual scandal. So we have here on the left the tabard of the Ulster King of Arms. And this is the title afforded to the individual who, amongst other duties, was responsible for the care of the Irish Crown Jewels. And Sir Arthur Vickers on the right, who was in post at the time of the theft, was sharing house at the time with a man called Francis Shackleton, who was also his assistant and worked alongside him at Dublin Castle. And Shackleton was known at that time to have sexual relationships with men. And he was also an intimate friend of King Edward VII's brother-in-law, the Duke of Argyll. And that becomes a little bit important later on in the story. So after the theft occurred, Vickers, who you see there, alleged that his assistant Shackleton plied him with alcohol in order to steal the keys to the safe from his pocket, make a wax impression, and replace them without Vickers ever noticing. Now, after the discovery of their theft, a police investigation was immediately launched, and Edward VII was furious about their theft and also launched a royal commission to inquire into their disappearance. But after only 1 week of investigation, the royal commission was adjourned without explanation, and it never met again. And it's been suggested that this was due to the direct intervention of Edward VII, who'd become alarmed by the possible connection made between the assistant Shackleton and his brother-in-law, the Duke of Argyll, who was already the subject of gossip concerning his sexuality at the time in the media. And this was in the early 20th century when monarchy was being questioned, revolution was in the air across Europe. So anything that could undermine their position or power was seen with great concern. Now, since there was nothing to directly link Shackleton to the crime, he was never punished. And to this day, the jewels have never been recovered, and no individual has been convicted of their theft. So if you're in Ireland and you have a shovel, do feel free to go looking for them. But as I say, it remains a really interesting mystery. And during the tour, we really try to highlight the fear of association with LGBTQ+ identity in the past. And again, really address the fact that for many people, this is still a lived reality today. We also have this painting back in the entrance hall of Mary of Modena, and this is one of my favourite paintings in the house.
5 minutes left, Chris.
Great. So we use this to discuss contemporary ideals around gender identity and gender expression. So in this portrait, you see Mary wearing she's had her clothes, she's wearing men's clothes, and she's had her hair styled to look like a man's wig. Now, when we take a bit more detail and discuss it a bit more on the tour, we hone in on the fact that this attire wasn't that uncommon in the 17th century, but a lot of visitors find it difficult to associate this with a female monarch at the time, because so many of the paintings we have depicting women have been created through the male gaze, and that is very much the case at Hillsborough Castle. And this is a woman standing, staring directly at the painter, with her hand on her hip. She's got a little whip in her hand as well, which I adore. And she has chosen to have herself presented in this way. And I think it's important for visitors to have this unexpected experience of this portrait, because it challenges our notion of how gender has been experienced and expressed throughout the centuries. I think we have this fixed idea that we have progressed and we move in this kind of growing fashion towards equality. But gender in its experience has been experienced in so many different ways across the centuries. I'll move on to the next room. So this is the red room, probably my favourite room in the house because I think it looked like a big jewellery box. But one of the methods we used during the tour was to do a bit of queer art interpretation. So not just about identifying people in the past who were queer, but looking at objects through a queer lens. And the object we focus on is this painting by Fra Bartolomeo from the 16th century, or the 15th century, sorry, that depicts St. Francis and St. Dominic embracing. And the focus here, as I say, isn't on whether either of them were queer, but instead we ask visitors to merely take a look at this painting and say what you see. And what you see are two men intimately embracing one another. And we use this to discuss the fact that intended queer representation in art, and particularly historic works of art, is very difficult to find. And as we've heard throughout the day, queer people existed in the past, but unfortunately were not represented. So as a community, as a group, we had to find things that represented us that maybe weren't necessarily intended to be so. And I think this is a really beautiful example of something that people may have been drawn to in the past. And we still do that in the modern day as well. You know, pop culture and things that aren't intentionally queer suddenly become queer in the 21st century as well. I'll just finish with one more very quick story. And this is the dining room. You can see it there set for a function. And this painting hangs above the fireplace in the dining room, and this depicts Lord Hillsborough, who later became the 4th Marquess of Downshire. And he was born in 1812, and throughout his life he developed this rather unfortunate habit of killing people. In fact, Hillsborough's curators have identified 4 kills to date. I'm going to focus on one of these deaths, and that was during his time as a student at Oxford. And he got into a fight with the favourite son of the Marquess of Londonderry, and you guessed it, killed him. Now, scandalised by this, his family decided that he needed to lie low because he also had a habit of talking to the press. And we've got lots of examples of him going to newspapers and pleading his innocence and saying it wasn't him, it was an accident. So instead of sending him on the normal grand tour that men of his class were sent on, they shipped him off to Scandinavia because they knew that there was nobody there he could talk to. And it was during this visit that he met the now infamous woman, Anne Lister, who we've heard a lot about today already. Some of you probably watched Gentleman Jack, which told her story in a really, really fabulous way. But for those of you that don't, really quick recap, she is now famous for her notorious diaries, which were written in code and revealed her sexual and romantic relationships with women and her complete disinterest in men. And we discovered that Anne and Lord Hillsborough travelled through Scandinavia together, telling border guards that they were husband and wife, and writing letters to one another describing the beauty of the Princess of Denmark when they both met her at a ball. Now, we can never really know if Lord Hillsborough was aware of Anne's relationships with women, but given the nature of these letters, the masculine attire that she chose to wear, and the closeness of their friendship as demonstrated in the letters, we certainly like to think that he was aware. I use this as an example of the difficulty in finding queer stories, and I'm not ashamed to admit that the only reason we find out that this even happened was because Lord Hillsborough was mentioned in the last episode of the BBC drama. We all kind of freaked out when we saw it on television, and we went looking in the archives and found his letters. And we would never have looked there. There's no evidence of Anne Lister's letters in the Downshire family papers. So this was just sheer chance. And it's an example of the challenge in telling these stories, but also it can be a bit of a treasure trove as well. So last slide, I promise. Moving forward for us, I think one of the challenges will be in determining how we expose the general visitor with no prior interest in queer heritage to hear these stories and to become aware of these contemporary issues. Because this is a specific LGBTQ+ tour, you tend to find people who have an interest or are related in some way to the LGBTQ+ community are the people that will come on these tours. So we're trying to work out ways of feeding this narrative into the general tour as well, so more people hear it. And I think how exactly we're going to do that it remains to be open for debate. And I think COVID has put a lot of barriers in our way, but certainly that's our big ambition. And I hope I've shown that our built heritage really is filled with LGBTQ plus stories that are just waiting to be told. And obviously the stories I told there come from a very elite perspective still, so there's a lot of work to be done around telling more working class histories and more ethnic minority histories. But I think ultimately our ultimate goal has always been to give history and a place in history to people who have so often been denied that place. And Hillsborough Castle is a very known place in Northern Ireland, and as I showed you at the start, has been part of history, particularly in the 20th century. So for somewhere like this to tell these stories is meaningful, and the feedback we've gotten from people shows that it is meaningful. And all our fears of controversy were never really realised, because these stories deserve to be told, and I think we have to be brave and tell them and know that it is the right thing to do. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I think I now know which place is at the top of my list next time I'm visiting Northern Ireland.
Oh, please
You've
do.
just piqued my interest so much with those stories. It's absolutely fascinating. And thank you for being so honest about only discovering the Hillsborough and Lister connection through the TV show. I need to rewatch it now. So thanks, Chris. And now we're heading over to Wales, back to Wales, as we began in Wales, with Andrew White, who's the Director of Wales for the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Take it away, Andrew.
Hi there, everybody. Bore da and good morning. As you just heard, I'm Andrew. I'm the Director of the National Lottery Fund in Wales, National Lottery Heritage Fund in Wales, important word there. I want to begin where we did begin, with language, and I am a proud bilingual Welshman, and we have 2 languages and twice the complexity of sensitivity here. And just an observation, originally the Welsh dictionary referred to homosexuals as gwrwgydwyr, which translates as man grabbers, in a very predatory kind of way. When it progressed, they used the term cyfenrywiol, homosexual, and interestingly there was no term for heterosexual, so they then developed the term for heterosexual, which was anghyfenrywiol, which translates as non-homosexual. So one of the very rare moments in history where heterosexual people were defined by their identity in relation to us LGBT people. So I'm going to stick with the term LGBT plus or LGBTQ. I'm sure I will vary between the two. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the work that I've been doing since joining the fund. Prior to joining the fund June last year, I spent the previous decade as the director of Stonewall Cymru, LGBT charity. Currently in my spare time, I'm a community editor for Wales's online LGBTQ magazine, which is called Lgbtq and click and subscribe, please, if you don't. Oh, I've got to share my screen as well, and it's 18 months and I'm still not used to Zoom, so bear with me, and you should soon have my screen. Please do shout anyone if it's not there. So at the fund, we're really proud to support projects that celebrate LGBT plus heritage. Over the past 20 years, we've awarded £7.5 million to LGBT plus specific heritage projects across the UK. We're committed to building on that foundation and forging stronger relationships with LGBT plus communities, culture, history, and heritage organisations more widely now and into the future. And I want to talk to you today about some of the work I've been involved in since joining the fund. I've been looking at our equality, diversity and inclusion work, which I was asked to do on day 4 after joining the fund, to look widely right across our work on EDI. I'm going to look at how our funding framework approaches inclusion, and I'm going to show you some examples of some of the work that we funded on LGBT plus projects, and I'm going to finish with a plea to point you in the right direction if you've got an idea or know someone that does have an idea of a project you might think is eligible for funding. So I'll start with the EDI review, and I am going to continue to use EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion. I was asked to coordinate a review, and the aim was to define an ambitious vision of heritage, inclusive heritage, to guide our work, operational work and our grant giving activities. And when we talk about inclusion, we mean equal and fair access for everyone, regardless of age, sex, disability, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, faith, class or income. And we drew on the knowledge and expertise of valued partners, grantees, prospective applicants, staff and trade unions. We commissioned some external research, and we looked across investment, governance, culture and our workforce. And the review, which is available on our website now, I'll pop a link in the chat when I've finished, it identifies some really clear areas for us to build on as part of our ambition to create greater equality, diversity and inclusion within our work and in our grant giving and across the heritage sector. It also highlights some areas where we need to reflect and challenge more, including some of the longer term issues that we will need to address. So it's important that we take some time to do some of those things effectively, and that we do some of the quicker things immediately. We have an external task force who are helping us with that. They are an absolute pleasure, an absolute variety of expertise, of lived experience from across the various sectors that we tend to lump in and call a heritage sector. The review shows us, you know, we do a lot, we've still got a lot to do, and we need to do some of that more quickly. During the review, as I say, we spoke to a wide range of internal and external stakeholders, and we'll use what we've learned. We'll use it to increase positive social impact of heritage for underrepresented communities, and to look at our approach to recruiting members, say, of our committees and our board, and also to more effectively nuance our investment work. So we do have an inclusion outcome, and we've done some research on that, and the research shows us that while some find it helpful, others, specifically when they want to look at a specific group or community, find it sounds a bit narrowing, and I'll come on to that. This is our inclusion outcome. It's a mandatory outcome. Everyone that gets funding from us must have this as part of their objectives. A wider range of people will be involved in heritage. And we believe that heritage is a crucial role to play in contributing to a flourishing, more equitable and inclusive society as a whole. And that's why we make this mandatory. Everyone has to ensure that a wider range of people are involved in heritage. What it means is that if a project is a success, then the range of people benefiting from heritage will be more diverse than before the project started. It includes audience development, work and community consultation and planning. It means that people have to collect and analyse information about what they do and who engages with the heritage, and of course those who don't. Things that we recommend people consider in developing their inclusion work: budgeting for inclusion. You know, explore those costs right up front. So, you know, we will fund work on inclusion. You need to not retrofit it into a project or see it as an added extra, but it's a core part of that project. Be welcoming and listen. It sounds like it shouldn't be rocket science, but for some projects that is challenging. Noticing who's missing, who's not being heard. And we've just heard, you know, some great examples of that, and the heritage. When we start to delve deeper into specific elements of our heritage, then we find those missing voices and missing stories. And Norena, you know, is a great role model of mine in having found some great and celebrate some great heritage stories here in Wales from the queer community. Build inclusive partnerships. So, you know, don't always try and come up with the answers. If you need to work in partnership with queer organisations, LGBT organisations, then do so, and also pay for their time and build it into your grant application. Share your inclusion guidance. So, you know, use your guidance, learn from others, adapt or adopt as appropriate. Inclusion is a continual process. So every day is a school day, is what my dad used to say, and it continues to be so. Measure the impact. So, you know, the so what question, is it having an impact? And be flexible. You know, there's no one size fits all here. And we encourage organisations, as I say, to be open, to listen, to learn, and to share their experiences and their knowledge. Then I'm going to move on to some case studies, and I'm going to take you through these as quickly as I can, because I'm aware people will want to join the Q&A. So I'm going to start with Queering Spires, History of LGBTIQA+ Spaces in Oxford. Temporary exhibition, Queering Spires aimed to tell the untold stories of hidden queer spaces in the city of Oxford. Local authority run museum wanted to focus on the principles of a circular economy, and to counter the fact that temporary exhibitions tend to generate lots of waste. So whilst they're telling a queer story, they're also telling a story about environmental sustainability. And the exhibition ran at the Oxford Town Hall from September 2019 to March 2020. And drum roll please, they won the Sustainable Project of the Year award at the Museums and Heritage Awards in 2020. So a great queer prize-winning story here. And then we go back briefly to Northern Ireland, and a fantastically imaginatively titled project called The Troubles I've Seen. So in 2019, we announced a £70,000 grant for The Troubles I've Seen. It's the first large-scale LGBT+ project of its kind to be funded in Northern Ireland. It was a 2-year project and aimed to capture and record the memories and experiences of LGBT+ community in Northern Ireland in the 1980s and 90s. So a time of really significant legislative change and challenge. You know, through this project, we hear the story of those that lived during this period of time, through this period of time, queer stories from the times of the Troubles. And the funding was used to recruit volunteers, provide training on a range of heritage and media skills. And the volunteers then collated important artifacts, documents, historic materials held by partner organisations, which are currently in storage. And they create a digital archive to safeguard this heritage. And as you'll see, the pain and joy of the slide above you, much of this has had to be delivered during COVID and over these wonderfully cumbersome technical facilities that we have available to us now. Richard O'Leary, when we asked the project coordinator on this, when we asked what advice he'd give to heritage organisations to help them engage with the LGBT community, said heritage organisations need to be aware that there's an appetite for LGBT heritage from both the LGBT community and from wider society. And I think that's a real comfort to me as a gay man, to hear that there is an appetite for it. The fear of controversy in putting together a project can sometimes hold people back, but actually no, we want to hear about it. Also, the advice was if you reach out to LGBT individuals and organisations, they'll find partners in helping them bring the heritage to life and bring it to fore. And finally, we get back to Wales. It all comes back to Wales for Hands on Heritage. And this is young people exploring the LGBT+ past of Wales. And Greg referenced earlier the appetite amongst young people to get involved in heritage, and the Hands-on Heritage Project is a great example there. It's a project at Amgueddfa Cymru, the National Museum of Wales, which enabled young people from diverse backgrounds to have an impact on the collections of the museums. And thanks to a grant from ourselves of 875,000, which was allocated through the Kick the Dust programme, it transformed the way that young people interact with our national museums across Wales. The Hands-on Heritage Project, it saw 16 to 25-year-olds explore the collections, really get in there, over 7 museums in the National Museum collection, uncovering some LGBT plus stories, some fascinating stories. One of the young people involved, Holly Morgan Davis, wrote about this in a blog on our website, you can see, including profiling some of the great role models of Welsh queer history. Jan Morris, historian and travel writer; Sarah Jane Rees, otherwise known as Cranogwen, a poet and teacher and campaigner and winner of the national chair of the Eisteddfod; Gwen John, Angus McBean. And they also had the opportunity to study and handle some of the 5 million objects throughout the Amgueddfa Cymru collection, and to bring to life our national rich LGBT plus history. They came across a number of collections and added to the collection. You'll see the national rainbow flag here, badges commemorating Pride 97, Lesbian and Gay Pride in 1988, various things from leaflets to wristbands to even an autographed photograph of the actor and composer Ivan Novello, and bringing them right up to date, a copy of a poem written for the first ever Black Asian Minority Ethnic Pride in Wales in 2019. I mentioned the money was awarded through the Kick the Dust programme. The Kick the Dust programme was named by young people, and their aspiration was to stir up heritage. We call them dust kickers. It's a pioneering grant scheme. It distributed 10 million across the UK to youth organisations. And I'm catching a breath. And a final observation from me really is that when I was growing up gay in a working class family in South Wales, there are very few, if any, LGBT role models or histories talked about. It made me and my peers feel invisible. And I know Norena's talked about invisible histories. Finding out that people like me and my queer siblings existed and contributed to our history, our nation, our heritage and culture, that was affirming. And for some, still to this day, particularly our trans siblings, it can even be life-saving. I've spoken about a couple of LGBT plus projects, and we're really interested to hear from these specific kinds of projects, but we're also interested in hearing how LGBT plus history can be celebrated within larger scale projects. So while standalone projects and focused projects are extremely valuable, and we continue to invite you to put applications for them, we should be careful as a sector as well not to overlook the significance of real, true, full inclusion in all projects. So if you have an idea for an LGBT plus project, or an organisation that works with LGBT people, or indeed how to make your larger scale project LGBT plus inclusive, we really would love to hear from you. We want heritage to tell everyone's story. We want it to represent everyone's past, and by ensuring that heritage is inclusive, we'll ensure that no experience is missing, that our heritage is fully told and fully inclusive. So let's work together to achieve this. Thank you. Diolch.
Inspiring. Thank you, Andrew. It's just so great to hear about the work that you and the fund are doing to ensure that inclusivity is at the heart of everything that you do, but also at the heart that everything that funded project managers like myself do as well. It is really inspiring. It's time now for our Q&A session. So if anyone wants to jump in, switch your microphone on, ask any questions, or you can use the raise your hand reaction button at the bottom of the screen. If you want to, please do, while we've got all our amazing speakers here. Or you can type it in the chat box as well. Does anybody have any questions? If not, I've got some.
Last one of Alice. Alice, you may have covered this, so I'm sorry if you did, but about your local heritage lists and getting people within the community to nominate ideas. How did you then kind of sort out what were then, which became official and got onto the list? Did you accept everything, or did you have to kind of sift through them and decide? Because that sounds like a challenging thing. If people say this is important to us and you say, actually, we're not sure that's on the list. Could you explain that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So we developed criteria, and there is a selection panel who assesses it against the criteria, and then it'll go through a public consultation process and then go to our portfolio holder for a decision. In terms of communal heritage, which we're especially talking about communal heritage when we talk about diverse histories, to a certain extent, I don't think we'd ever second guess what's important to communities that we're not part of, because that's not actually true inclusion for a start. So you know, we'd be, if somebody says this is an important building to them, then we completely accept that.
Brilliant, thanks Alice. I've got a question here, which, well, it started off as a statement. It was LGBT, LGBTQ+, LGBTQ, and it ended up with LGBTQIA+ as well. What do we use? All of them?
I think we've all used different things, haven't we, as part of the presentation, but I think everybody said why they're using the different acronyms and why they've chosen to do those. I tend, sometimes it can be very, very prosaic, to be quite honest with you. So, for example, our LGBT employee network within the City Council, we haven't ever changed from LGBT to have plus or Q or anything else, just because our branding that we pay for our merchandise and it was basically LGBT employee network. So we can't add everything else now, but I think as long as you acknowledge why you're doing it.
I think as well, I agree with you that, you know, sometimes you have to consider funding and rebranding and everything, but also you are sometimes constricted by what you're producing. For example, the book, A Practical Guide to Searching LGBTQIA Historical Records, was simply because you can't put a plus in the title on a book. They just wouldn't let it. So it comes out as LGBTQIA, and then you start getting into alphabet soup and what you use, what you leave out, because the more you include, the more it's obvious you've left out. So that's why the plus was used for to cover everybody. But yes, I would say predominantly I use LGBTQ+.
Brilliant, thank you. Andrew, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I mean, I think my observation here is, as you can imagine, being a director of a national LGBT charity, and that was the acronym we used back then, I've been called an awful lot of things. My particular favourite is a known homosexual. I think my advice is, you know, go with, when you're working with communities and groups and individuals, go with the terminology that people use or prefer. But also one of my bugbears, if you like, is referring to an individual as an LGBT person. Well, you can't be all of those, you know, or a combination of those things. You can't be, you know, lesbian, bisexual and gay and trans. So just, you know, if it's a little bit like the whole BAME debate that's been had recently, is, you know, if you can be specific, do. If you need to refer to a group, I use LGBT plus, sometimes I use queer, sometimes LGBTQ plus. But yeah, go take your lead from the community or from the individuals you're dealing with is my advice, and never refer to someone as an LGBT plus person.
Great advice, thank you. Emma, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so my question is for Chris. I'm on a project that's about engaging rural community groups in Northern Ireland with heritage. So I'll be setting up a grant making scheme in December. And I'm really keen on rural communities to hopefully get on board with taking a bit of funding and maybe exploring their LGBT history. But have you any tips on, I suppose, how to get rural communities to you know, engage in their heritage? Yeah, I'm just finding it really tough, especially in the rural communities, as you know yourself. When you get into the countryside, it's harder to tell them stories, but in the big city, in Belfast, Derry, it definitely feels like there's more stories being told. But I'm just wondering, have you any tips?
Yeah, I think you're completely right. It's very difficult to engage with the LGBTQ plus community, because I think more and more we realize, well, what does that mean? And I know that we're at Hillsborough, because Hillsborough is in a more rural location, although it's only about half an hour outside of Belfast. We reached out to our kind of local groups, so we didn't necessarily seek LGBTQ plus groups. We did, but we also went to sort of local community groups as well, where there may be LGBTQ plus people part of those groups. And some of those people were able to give us a really specific perspective on their experience of living in that area, which I thought was really good. And I know in Northern Ireland, you have the big groups like Cara Friend and Rainbow and Here and I. And you do even have there's like a gay farmers network. There's groups that exist in rural locations. There's Mid-Ulster Pride, which is a really interesting group, and I'm sure you know about them. That's really very rural, but I'd like to have a think about it and maybe drop you an email.
Yeah, that'd be good.
Because I do think it's a really challenging group to engage with, and I say that about myself as part of that group, because there's so much, there are so many different identities beyond our identity as lesbian or gay or bi or whatever, and I think that whatever's happening in somebody's life at that moment might depend on what group they're aligned to and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's definitely value in engaging with local community groups that undoubtedly will have people who identify in that way as part of those groups. So that could be a good first step, I suppose. But I will have a think and try to give you a better answer than this rambling one right now.
Cheers.
Thanks, Emma. Chris, Alice, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just coming back to the acronym question. I think language is a really important question around diversity, and I think it's often one of the things that's the biggest barrier in between, like, people actually working in partnership or getting to know each other or getting to understand other people's lives, because I think a lot of the time with language we're worried about being offensive, and I think a lot of the time, I mean, to be honest, people can ask me about anything, and if they use a phrase that would be seen as offensive, I'll talk to them about it and I'll let them know why it's offensive, and actually having honest conversations and actually
I think we've lost Alice.
being a bit relaxed about language. I like the way that I got cut off just at the point where I was talking about being cut off.
That wasn't deliberate. Sorry, Alice, you're coming in and out there.
Yeah, I was just saying that I think yeah, we just need to have honest conversations and just talk to each other.
I think you're completely right there. I know from my own point of view as a disabled person and within the disabled community, the language that's used about us is often, you know, so cringeworthy. And you can obviously see that some, say, local authorities, for example, haven't consulted on the language to use. Only yesterday I was reading a local paper on some development work in my own village, and they were referring to children being alternatively abled. And as soon as I read those words, it's like my hackles went up. Who on earth has told them to use those words? But I suppose, yeah, it's just being sensitive to, you know, even within a community, there can be so many varying views on the words to use. You do have to be quite careful. Shane, you've got your hand up. Sorry, it took a while to get to you.
No, morning, Bev. Morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Picking up actually just on Emma's question about, and not to turn this into the Northern Ireland show, but it kind of came up in, we had a network natter here last week, and this morning's event came up and we were talking about, I suppose, one of the issues here, and I wondered just about the other people from other bits of the country talking about how the interaction with more established heritage groups who maybe feel a little bit precious about their control over heritage, how those interactions have gone. And without going too far down the detail, I guess there's a campaign here in Northern Ireland to get a blue plaque for Mark Ashton, who featured in Pride, the movie, and was very involved in the miners' strike issue in Wales back in the 80s. And just in a very conservative place like Northern Ireland, we sometimes get very caught up in wanting to not be offensive to people, but equally wanting to challenge some of the established kind of approaches and thoughts. I just wondered what people in other parts of the country kind of had felt with those established organizations and LGBT issues, and kind of how that conservatism got broken down.
I'm happy to talk from Nottingham. So all of our plaques we do in partnership with Nottingham Civic Society, who are mainly made up of people in you know, 70s plus, if I'm quite honest, and mainly white, and actually again, we've just been having an honest conversation about different things that you know, can be regarded as history. And actually it's got to the point where so I've just signed off a press release for the Plaque Unveiling on Friday, and the chair of the Civic Society said how proud she is of the fact that of the contribution that LGBT plus community have made to the life of the city. So, you know, we've just been just talking with them about different ideas, and it hasn't always been smooth sailing as so for example, you know, we had one event at the castle in Nottingham where somebody from the Civic Society said, why should we talk about Black history? Nobody who's Black ever comes to our talks. And it's like, But do you know what? At that event, everybody in the room challenged that view, and we had a really good open discussion about it, and actually about kind of visibility and why would you want to go to something where you're not gonna you know, hear about your community or your stories. So you know, it's been open dialogue, really.
Shane, what we did, Beverly will tell you, I'm a little bit of a disruptor in Wales. A little. I got the whole community. I just said to the community, tell us all about yourselves. And we held, like I've put in there, we held a bit of a fair, and it turned into a full-blown festival because the community got involved and started running it. And we had bands from all different genres. We actually had a full-blown drag act that came on, and it was walking around with all the kids and talking to them about where they came from. And we were educating people without educating them. So when the kids came up and asked them, you know, Gavin, or Gale Force, as he's better known, was telling them all about him. And it was great because the kids were interacting. And then some of the young people were talking about their stories. And then some of the older people that had never really shared their stories were talking about what a struggle they'd been through. So it was great hearing all these different stories that we captured all through the day. And I think when you have a community and you make them part of the project and they run the project, then all you've got to do is be there and make sure that you nurture that and make sure that no one gets harmed.
Brilliant, thanks, Vicky. Greg, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just on Shane's point again. When we started our project in Derbyshire, I think a few of us were quite nervous about the reception we might get from some of the more established heritage organisations in the county, which is large, dispersed, very rural in parts. And I think I mentioned when I was speaking that there were one or two who didn't engage with us. I think looking back, the fear of people not engaging with us was actually far greater than the reality on the ground. By and large, people were not just engaging, but really enthusiastic, really keen, saying, we've been having these discussions for a while, but we don't know what to do with it. We don't feel like we're equipped with the language or the skills to tell these stories in a way where we feel confident doing so. So more often than not, we actually ended up kind of knocking at an open door. And when I think back to the 2 or 3 times where we had either a knockback or silence, it kind of echoes what Norena was saying. It was some of, at the time, the bigger players, the likes of the National Trust and some of the other stately homes, who actually, since those conversations, many of them have begun doing those things by themselves anyway, because the world is changing and we're now at that tipping point where actually all you need is, within any organisation, one or hopefully more than one person who is either a member of the community or an ally or is willing to speak up about that, to start those conversations and start things changing. So it does feel like there's a real tipping point now where pretty much everywhere we've been to, there are more yeses than nos. And even those that held out, like I say, over time have come along. So I appreciate that you're in a different place in different circumstances, but the world is still changing in our favour, I hope.
Thanks, Greg. Andrew, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, two observations really, and one is when approaching what might be fearful or difficult conversation or campaign or engagement strategy is to use the kind eyes approach. So you know, to start out with, not everyone has the same grasp of, you know, the latest language or terminology, but, you know, as long as they're not using, you know, racist or queerphobic terminology, bring them along with you. So assume with kind eyes that people want to do the right thing. And I think that I found that a useful approach, certainly in my work over the years. And then secondly, it's about identity and community. So, you know, the LGBTQ plus community. Well, you know, we're not a gated community somewhere in West Wales, much that Norena and I would love to set that up. You know, we live in, I live here in a former mining village in the South Wales Valleys. We live in metropolitan centres. We're black, we're white, we're women, we're men, we're non-binary. You know, we're Muslims, we're Christians, we're rural, we're urban. So actually, you know, when defining a community, be very careful. And rural communities also include queer people as well. So I think it's about trying wherever possible to use us language. You know, this isn't, you know, we're the benevolent, you know, project here benefiting these poor, unfortunate people who have a different sexual orientation or gender identity to ours. You know, so it's about, you know, this is our community, it's our heritage, which actually includes, you know, heritage of people of faith, heritage of disabled people, heritage of queer people. You know, when you talk about the South Wales mining heritage, for instance, well, you know, let's talk about, you know, the black coal miners in South Wales. Let's talk about, you know, the experiences of queer people in these communities. So rather than let's tell a queer story, it's tell the full story. And I think that often, particularly in rural communities, it's like, you know, talking about Jan Morris and her excellent writing about Ceredigion, for instance, a really traditional rural community in the west of Wales. Well, Jan was one of theirs, you know. So I think that approach for me is something that I've found useful, certainly.
Thanks, Andrew. I think the conversation's heading in this direction, but we've only got a few minutes left. So I just wanted to very quickly touch on allyship and, you know, how to be an ally to members of the LGBT community. And I know we've only got 3 minutes left, and I think this could be an event in itself, in a way. So watch this space. But I just wondered if our speakers from this morning could maybe just give, you know, a quick sort of overview of your thoughts on how to be a good ally, particularly from, you know, heritage and heritage project point of view. Sorry, that's put you all on the spot.
Shall I start?
Go for it, Norena.
Visibility, visibility, visibility. People, in order to get allies, people need to understand. They need to see you. They need to see you as human beings, not see these trashy headlines in the awful newspapers. We need positive exhibitions. We need positive displays. We need positive, everything positive coming out that shows we are just people like everybody else. So visibility is the catchword.
Anyone else?
I think as well, it's important to be brave in the decisions that we make, because a lot of people who identify as queer or LGBTQ plus or whatever have come from perhaps vulnerable backgrounds, are not in a position to put themselves forward to do this work. And I think as an ally, it's important to empower people and to feel brave in yourself to do that work. I know that I at times have felt very vulnerable and very exposed in doing this work, because not only are you saying I'm talking about this history, but certainly more often than not, it is queer people who are telling these stories. And I've given tours that I know, for a very quick story, but I gave a tour once where there was a glitch in our booking system and loads of people booked onto it who didn't realize it was an LGBTQ plus tour. And they all stayed and they all really enjoyed it, but I felt really panicked at the beginning. I felt very exposed, I felt very vulnerable, and thankfully I had colleagues there who are allies and who stepped up. But I think it's important to know that that's the case for a lot of people, and for you yourself to be brave and to know that you know, it's your place as well to tell these stories. It's not just about identifying in that way. We all have friends and family and people we love who do as well. So yeah, I think that's a big one for me.
I mean,
yeah, I think. Oh, sorry.
You go, Alice.
I think you're completely right, and I think within the community, we've always relied on allies and friends and families for support. And I think a lot of it is about visibility, like Norena was saying, in terms of if you have a gay friendly venue, or if you've got somebody with a rainbow lanyard or something like that, you know immediately it's a safe space. And it's about like creating safe spaces and having safe spaces to actually, you know, go out and feel you don't have to kind of justify how who you are, your authenticity, how you know, love or whatever.
I mean, being an ally for me, it starts with listening to people who you don't share that particular identity with. It then requires a knowledge and understanding of my own privilege and position, and then bringing all that together to use whatever I've got to amplify what I've heard and what I've listened to. And I guess for me, that's it. Listen to the voices, amplify them.
Greg, have you any last thoughts?
I know we discussed this in the planning, but I'm very aware that we don't have trans representation on our speaker panel this morning. I know it's something we've discussed, and I mean, Alice mentioned, and I've had this in the heritage sector, I feel incredibly privileged, but I've had moments of not willingly outing myself because I don't want the potential risk that comes along with that. And I think for our trans siblings, for some of them, walking out of the door in the morning is a political act. And I think we have to be, as Chris said, we have to be brave. We have to be willing to speak out on behalf of those who are facing even more disadvantage than we are. So for me, that's the real thing.
Such important points, definitely. Thank you so much for this morning to all of our speakers. It's been absolutely invaluable. I've learned a lot. I hope everybody else has too. We'll be putting the recording of this this webinar on our website and on our YouTube channel for a short period. So if you do think that any of your colleagues or anyone that you know of, particularly within the heritage sector, but even more widely, if they would find it useful, please share the link with them. I'll send it out once it's been uploaded. And thank you also to the National Lottery Heritage Fund and Make Your Mark for making this possible as well. But yeah, thank you everybody. If anybody does have any last questions, if you want to email them to me, I'll be dropping you in all an email a little bit later on with the dreaded feedback form that we really need you to fill in. Thank you. If you have any questions for the panelists, I can pass them on and get back to you. But for now, thank you again to all our speakers, and thank you to everybody for attending. Bye for now.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.